Finn Keller never expected a 5-minute walk to preschool drop-off to change his life. But fate didn't exactly check your schedule before turning it upside down. "Dad, you're stepping on something shiny." 5-year-old Rosie tugged at his coat sleeve, her curly brown hair bouncing as she pointed at the sidewalk. Finn squinted down. Nestled between a crack in the pavement and a patch of melting snow was something that definitely didn't belong in his world, something delicate, glittering, and absurdly out of place. He crouched, brushing it free. A necklace. Not costume jewelry, but real gold, with a deep blue stone set in the center. He turned it over in his hand. It was elegant, expensive-looking, and definitely not from the bargain bin where he'd shop for his sister's birthday. "Whoa," Rosie whispered. "It looks like it belongs to a princess," he half laughed. "Yeah, well, the princess probably wants it back." Finn tucked it into his coat pocket, kissed Rosie's forehead, and walked her into the preschool building. On the way out, he stared at the necklace again. It had a tiny engraving on the clasp FZ. "Initials," he muttered, then sighed. "Great, real helpful." Back at the auto shop, Finn showed it to Theo, his co-worker and best friend. "Man, that thing's worth more than this whole garage. You sure it's not fake?" "Pretty sure," Finn said. "It's heavy." "And the chain's too refined." Theo leaned closer. "What are you gonna do with it?" "Try to return it." "What else, dude?" Theo laughed. "You don't even know who lost it." Finn glanced around the cluttered garage, oil cans, busted bumpers, and the radio playing something from the early 2000s. He couldn't explain it, but something about the necklace felt important, like it mattered to someone. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of it. Later that night, after Rosie was asleep and their tiny apartment had gone quiet, he posted the photo on a local neighborhood lost and found board, hoping the owner would come across it. He didn't know the necklace belonged to someone who never scrolled through neighborhood boards. Someone who had assistance and security teams, not community forums, but she noticed it anyway. Francesca Zeller leaned back in the backseat of her black town car, one heel already kicked off, her phone buzzing in her hand. "Miss Zeller," her assistant June said from the passenger seat, "we've got a hit. Someone posted a photo of your necklace." Francesca's heart jumped in her chest. "Where?" "On a local forum. Some guy found it on West 54th. Posted it this morning." "Get me the post." June turned around, holding out her phone. Francesca stared at the photo. There it was. Her sapphire necklace, custom designed, a gift from her late grandmother, and the only thing she cared about more than her company. "Who posted it?" she asked. "Username is just Finn K. Could be a first name and last initial." Francesca narrowed her eyes. "Find him." Finn didn't expect a woman in heels and a suit that probably cost more than his car to show up at Rosie's preschool the next morning. "Are you Finn?" she asked, her voice smooth, commanding, and definitely not used to being ignored. He turned, holding his daughter's tiny backpack in one hand and a thermos of lukewarm coffee in the other. Yeah, can I help you?" She extended her hand. "Francesca Zeller." "I believe you found something of mine," he blinked. "Wait, the necklace." Her gaze was direct. "Yes." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling it out and handing it over. It was just lying there on the sidewalk. "I didn't want to sell it or anything. I was trying to find the owner." She took it gently, her hands suddenly softer, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Thank you. This means more to me than you can imagine." Finn nodded awkwardly. "Glad I could help." Francesca tilted her head. "Can I buy you coffee?" He blinked. "What?" "You returned something irreplaceable. I'd like to thank you properly." He hesitated. Rosie tugged on his sleeve. "Can I have a chocolate croissant?" Francesca gave a small smile. "I know a place." The cafe was quiet, upscale, and definitely not somewhere he would have chosen. But Rosie was in heaven with her pastry, and Finn was trying not to feel like he'd wandered into a movie he wasn't cast for. "So," Francesca asked, sipping her espresso, "what do you do?" "Auto repair," he said. "I'm a mechanic. Own a small shop with my friend." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "And your wife?" "Gone," he said, a little too quickly. "Left when Rosie was 3. Francesca's eyes softened. "I'm sorry," he shrugged. "It's fine, we're doing okay." She looked at him for a long moment like she was seeing something most people missed. "You know," she said, "I don't usually chase people down in person." "I figured," she smiled. "But I had a feeling." a feeling. That whoever found my necklace wasn't just going to hand it over to a doorman. Finn looked at her, this gorgeous, powerful woman sitting across from him like they weren't from two different worlds. "You're not exactly what I expected either." She leaned in. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone with a driver and 1,000 meetings. Not someone who'd chased down her grandmother's necklace herself," he nodded. She glanced at Rosie, now deep into a chocolate-smeared drawing of a dinosaur, and then back at him. "Maybe I needed a break from meetings," he chuckled. "Well, you found the right guy for that. That should have been the end of it, but Francesca called him 2 days later. "I need my car looked at," she said. "And I trust you more than my usual place." So she brought her sleek black Mercedes into his garage and stood there in heels and a tailored coat while he checked her engine. They talked, about nothing and everything. She asked about Rosie's school, and he asked if she ever actually got a day off. By the time she left, he was grinning like a fool. 2 days after that, she dropped by again, with coffee. And lunch. After that, it became a thing. "You like her," Theo said one afternoon, watching Francesca walk across the lot in a white blouse that didn't belong anywhere near brake fluid. Finn wiped his hands on a rag. "She's different," she's loaded. "She's also kind. She's a galaxy out of your league." Finn didn't answer, he already knew that, but when she looked at him, she didn't see a poor single dad. She didn't see grease under his fingernails, or the fact that he couldn't remember the last time he went on a real date. She just saw him. And he was starting to see her, too, not the CEO in the heels and power suits, but the woman who smiled at his daughter, who stayed longer than she had to at the shop, who laughed in a way that made his chest tight. He was falling. Fast, and he had no idea what was waiting on the other side. Francesca stepped over a wrench lying on the garage floor, her heels clicking against the concrete. The air smelled like engine oil and pine-scented fresheners hung from the rearview mirrors of cars in various stages of disassembly. Finn glanced up from under the hood of a vintage Mustang, a streak of sweat on his temple and a wrench in his hand. "You're 10 minutes early," he said, not looking away from the engine. "I figured you wouldn't mind," Francesca said, setting a paper bag on the nearest workbench. "I brought lunch. Sandwiches from that little deli on Hudson." He lowered the hood and wiped his hands on a towel. "That place with the pepper focaccia, you remembered." "I remember most things," he said, lifting the bag. "Especially when free food is involved." Francesca leaned against the wall, folding her arms. "You're not easy to buy lunch for, you know. You never ask for anything." Finn shrugged. "I don't need much." "That's not the same as not wanting anything." He paused, searching her face. "You always talk in riddles." "Only when I'm uncomfortable," she replied, eyes flicking to the Mustang. "That car's older than I am. Still runs better than half the ones out there," he said. "Sometimes the old stuff just needs the right hands." She didn't answer. Her gaze dropped to the floor where a grease stain spread like a shadow beneath the car. "Did you always want to work on cars?" she asked. He hesitated, then pulled over a stool and sat. "No, I wanted to be a pilot." Her brows lifted. "Seriously," he nodded. "Used to stare at the sky for hours as a kid. Thought if I could just get high enough, everything down here would make more sense." "Why didn't you pursue it?" "Life," he said simply. "My mom got sick, bills piled up. I dropped out of school to help. Then I ended up here." Francesca sat beside him, careful not to let her suit brush against anything greasy. "Do you regret it?" "Some days," he admitted. "But then Rosie runs into my arms and all I can think is, maybe this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." She looked at him for a long time. "You ever think about what your life would look like if things had gone differently?" "All the time," he said. "But thinking about what could have been doesn't change what is. I've got a kid who thinks I hung the stars." "That's more than I ever thought I'd have." Francesca opened the bag and handed him a sandwich. "You're the only person I know who talks about disappointment like it's a blessing." Finn took the food, unwrapping it slowly. "You ever think about what your life would look like if you weren't running a company?" She hesitated. "I used to imagine it before everything got so loud. Meetings, investors, press, expectations. It's like standing in the middle of Times Square and trying to hear someone whisper your name. You ever get quiet time?" "Not really," she said. "Silence feels like a luxury, one I forgot how to afford." Finn leaned back against the wall, chewing thoughtfully. You could stay here a while. My place isn't exactly silent, but Rosie sings to her stuffed animals and the TV only works on 2 channels. Francesca laughed an unguarded, startled sound. Is that your version of an invitation? Might be, he said. If you don't mind the sound of cartoons and a fridge that hums like a lawnmower. I've had worse offers. As the afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, casting gold onto the concrete floor, Francesca's phone buzzed on the workbench. She didn't move to check it. Finn noticed. Aren't you going to get that? No, she said. Not right now, he raised an eyebrow. You sure? Could be important. It always is, she replied. But I'm starting to think what's important and what's urgent aren't the same thing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What are you doing here, Francesca? Bringing you lunch. I mean, really. You could have sent someone. Why are you coming here yourself? She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, something raw, something vulnerable. Because when I'm here, I don't feel like I'm drowning. Finn looked away, caught off guard by the intensity of her words. That's a heavy thing to say to a guy with grease under his nails. You're the only person who doesn't expect anything from me. I think you expect more from yourself than anyone else does. Maybe, she said quietly, but when I'm around you, the noise fades. Even just for a little while, Theo poked his head through the garage door. Hey Finn, that customer with the busted alternator is back, wants to know if the car's ready. Finn pushed off the stool. Give me 5. Francesca stood too. I should go anyway. He held her gaze. You don't have to. I do, she said. But I'll be back. That night, after Rosie had gone to bed and the apartment was steeped in quiet, Finn sat on the couch staring at the necklace again. It was back in its box now, resting on the shelf where he kept spare keys and loose change. It didn't belong in his world, but neither did she, and yet she kept showing up. The next week, Francesca invited him to a gala. Wait, Finn said, standing in the middle of the garage, holding a wrench in one hand. You want me to come where? To a charity event, she said. Black tie. For the children's hospital. I don't own a tie or anything black except a hoodie with a coffee stain. Then I'll take care of it. I don't belong at those things. You belong wherever someone wants you, she said, and I want you there. He stared at her. Why? Because I'm tired of walking into rooms full of people who only see my last name, she said. I want to walk in with someone who sees me. The evening of the gala, Finn stood in front of the mirror in a tailored tuxedo that fit like it had been sewn onto him. He barely recognized himself. Rosie sat on the bed clutching a stuffed giraffe, eyes wide. Daddy, you look like a prince, he laughed. I feel like one of those wax statues at the museum. Francesca arrived in a silver town car. Her dress was deep navy, sleek and minimal, with a low back and a slit that revealed just enough to be dangerous. She looked like a secret you'd never be able to forget. You clean up nice, she said when he stepped outside. You look like trouble. Good, she said. I was hoping for that. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead and waiters floated by with champagne flutes. Finn kept close to her side, overwhelmed by the crush of tuxedos and designer gowns. You okay? She asked. Trying to figure out which fork to use. Just copy me, he did. And when she introduced him to board members and donors, she didn't say, this is my friend, or this is someone I know. She said, this is Finn. Like that name meant something to her. Like he wasn't just a mechanic with calloused hands, and a life she couldn't possibly understand. Later, as a string quartet played near the marble staircase, she leaned in and whispered, dance with me. I don't know how, then follow my lead. They moved slowly, his hand on her waist, her fingers at the back of his neck. Her perfume was subtle, something floral and clean. Her body fit against his like a memory he hadn't made yet. You're brave, he murmured, for dancing with you, for bringing me here. She looked up at him. I've been in rooms filled with 500 people and never felt seen. Tonight I feel seen. He held her closer. So do I. As the music swelled and the lights dimmed, Francesca rested her head against his shoulder. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt like they were pretending to belong. Francesca adjusted the strap of her heel as she stepped into the elevator of Finn's apartment building, a paper bag in one hand and a folded blanket under her arm. She hadn't planned on staying long, just a quick drop-off and goodbye, but something about the day had left her restless, as if every boardroom and phone call had only made her crave the quiet he carried around like armor. When the door opened, Rosie answered, wearing a tinfoil crown and socks that didn't match. She blinked up at Francesca, then grinned. "Did you come for the royal tea party?" Francesca held up the bag. "I brought cookies. Do I qualify?" Rosie stepped aside dramatically. "Only if you like imaginary tea and talking giraffes." Francesca laughed and stepped inside. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent. Finn was in the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves, a wooden spoon between his teeth as he stirred something on the stove. "You're brave," she said. "Cooking and parenting at the same time." He glanced over his shoulder. "Didn't expect company. I'm not company, I'm a cookie delivery system." He turned off the burner. "Then the door's always open." She set the bag on the table and removed the blanket from under her arm. "This is for Rosie. I saw it at the market. It looked like something she'd love." The blanket was pale yellow, stitched with little cartoon suns and bluebirds. Rosie immediately wrapped herself in it and collapsed onto the couch like a queen holding court. Francesca leaned against the counter. "You ever take a night off?" Finn poured the sauce into a bowl and shrugged. "Not really. Nights off cost money." "What if it didn't?" He looked at her. "You trying to buy me a vacation? Trying to convince you to let someone else carry the weight for once?" He dried his hands and leaned against the fridge. "That's not how this works. Maybe it should be." They stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound Rosie's voice narrating an invisible story to her blanket. Finn exhaled slowly. "You ever wonder what people would think if they saw you here?" Francesca tilted her head. "Is that what you're worried about? Gossip?" "I'm not worried about gossip. I'm worried about what this looks like when the lights come on." "Then stop looking at it like it's temporary." He blinked. "You think this is permanent. I think it could be something real," she said, stepping closer. "If you let it." He didn't move. "You've got a life that doesn't leave room for this. You don't get to decide what my life has room for." He ran a hand through his hair. "You're used to fine dining and private flights, Francesca. I fix busted exhausts and eat dinner off chipped plates." She closed the gap between them. "I'm not here for fine dining. I'm here because when I'm with you, the noise stops." He stared at her for a long moment, then looked past her toward Rosie, who was now singing softly to herself. "I don't want her getting attached to someone who disappears." Francesca's voice was steady. "Then don't let me disappear." That night, as Rosie fell asleep tangled in her new blanket, Francesca helped Finn wash dishes. He handed her a towel, their fingers brushing. She didn't pull away. "You know," she said, drying a plate, "I had a fiancé once." He paused. "Yeah, he was a venture capitalist, wore monogrammed shirts, told me I was too intense." Finn snorted. "He sounds like a real joy." He proposed on a yacht. His assistant filmed it. Finn raised an eyebrow. "Romantic." "I said yes because it looked good on paper. Then I realized I couldn't remember the last time he made me laugh. And you left." "I ended it the next morning." He handed her another plate. "What about now?" She met his eyes. "Now I'm looking for something that doesn't come with a press release." He dried his hands and leaned back against the counter. "You really think this could work?" "I think we won't know unless we let it." He glanced toward the hallway. "Rosie's been asking if you're coming to her school's family day." Francesca blinked. "She wants me there." She asked if the lady with the fancy shoes could be her guest. Francesca's breath caught. "I'd love to go. Then you'd better wear flats." "There's a three-legged race." She laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "I'll start training." The next morning, Francesca stepped out of a black SUV in front of the schoolyard, dressed in jeans and sneakers for the first time in years. Rosie ran up and grabbed her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Finn watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, trying not to smile like an idiot. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked. Francesca adjusted her sunglasses. "I've survived hostile takeovers, federal audits, and my father's 65th birthday party. I think I can handle a few kids with juice boxes." The event was chaos. Tug-of-war games, finger painting, and a bake sale that left frosting on every possible surface. Francesca threw herself into all of it, helping build paper kites, wiping juice from Rosie's chin, even taking a pie in the face during a fundraiser challenge. Finn watched her laugh, covered in whipped cream. surrounded by parents who didn't know her net worth or what board she chaired. And in that moment, she looked like someone who belonged anywhere. Afterward, Rosie clung to her hand all the way to the car. "You're coming back, right?" she asked. Francesca knelt down beside her. "If your dad says it's okay," Rosie looked up at Finn. "Dad," he nodded. "Yeah, it's okay." That night, back in her penthouse, Francesca stood barefoot in her kitchen, staring at the city skyline. Her phone buzzed, a message from her head of PR waiting to be answered. She ignored it. Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing up a new proposal, one that shifted a portion of her company's philanthropic budget toward local programs for single-parent families. She didn't tell anyone why. She didn't need to. The next week, Finn brought her to his sister's birthday dinner, just 6 people in a backyard with folding chairs and a cooler full of soda. Francesca brought homemade strawberry shortcake and helped string lights in the trees. Later, Finn found her sitting alone, staring up at the stars. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "I just forgot what this kind of quiet felt like." He sat beside her. "You miss the noise, sometimes, but not tonight." They were quiet for a long time, the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the house. Then she said, "My father thinks I'm wasting my time." He said that. He didn't have to. "What do you think?" She looked at him. "I think I've never wanted something to last more than I want this to." He turned to her. "Then fight for it. Because I can't give you yachts or headlines, but I can give you everything I've got, and I'll never walk away first." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You won't have to." But not everyone wanted to see them together. 2 days later, a photo surfaced online. Francesca at the school event, pie covered and smiling next to Finn. The caption was harmless, but the comments weren't. "Why is she slumming it with a mechanic? Is this some PR stunt? What happened to her standards?" She found the article in her office, her assistant pale and nervous. "I can get it taken down," June offered. "We'll spin it." Francesca stood, jaw tight. "Don't bother, let them talk." But it wasn't just gossip. A board member called that afternoon, questioning her judgment. A sponsor paused a deal. Suddenly, her personal life was public property. She showed up at Finn's garage that evening, eyes shadowed, lips pressed into a line. He saw her and immediately put down his tools. "What happened?" "They're coming for me," she said. "For us." He stepped closer. "Then let them. We don't owe anyone anything." She shook her head. "I don't care what they say about me, but I won't let them drag you or Rosie through the mud. You don't get to protect us by disappearing." "Maybe I do," she said, voice cracking. "Maybe the best thing I can do is walk away before this gets worse." He stared at her, chest tightening. "So that's it?" She hesitated. "I don't know what else to do." He didn't stop her when she turned to leave, but as the door closed behind her, something inside him broke. And across the city, in a penthouse filled with silence, Francesca curled up on a couch that had never felt emptier. The rain hit the windows like it was trying to claw its way inside. Finn sat at the kitchen table, unmoving, an untouched mug of coffee gone cold by his elbow. Rosie was at her cousin's house, giving him space he hadn't asked for but apparently needed. He hadn't seen Francesca in 6 days. The last time he did, she was walking away with her head held high but her voice trembling. He'd let her go, not because he wanted to, but because for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fight for something he couldn't fix with his hands. He spent the next days sleepless, staring at the ceiling, asking himself what he could have said to change her mind. Every answer felt like a lie. He didn't belong in her world and she didn't belong in his. But when they were together, it hadn't mattered. At least not until it did. A knock at the door pulled him from the spiral. He opened it, expecting Rosie's cousin or maybe Theo with another half-hearted attempt to drag him out of the apartment. Instead, it was June. He'd seen her only once before, but he remembered the sharpness in her eyes, the way she always seemed to be 2 steps ahead of the room. "I'm sorry for dropping by unannounced," she said, "but you weren't going to answer your phone." "I didn't know you had my number." "I have everything," she said. "May I come in?" He stepped aside reluctantly. She moved like someone who didn't waste time, her coat still damp from the rain, her expression unreadable. "She's been in meetings all week, buried, keeps saying she's fine. She's not." Finn leaned against the counter. "What do you want me to do about it?" June looked around the modest apartment, taking it in like an analyst scanning a report. I've worked for Francesca for 8 years. I've seen her walk away from billion-dollar deals without blinking. But I've never seen her like this. I'm not the one who left. No, she said, but you're the only one she listens to when she stops pretending she doesn't feel anything. Finn crossed his arms. You're here to convince me to go after her. I'm here because she won't ask you to. And because she's about to make a decision she won't come back from. What decision? She's selling her controlling shares, June said, stepping down from the board. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. She said it's the only way to stop the press from dragging you and your daughter into this. Said if she makes herself irrelevant, they'll lose interest. Finn stared at the floor. She's burning her life down to protect mine, June nodded, and she's doing it alone. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, his coat, and bolted for the door. The elevator ride to the Zeller Group's top floor felt like it took hours. When the doors opened, the receptionist made a move to stop him, but June appeared behind him and waved her off. Francesca's office was at the end of a long corridor lined with glass and silence. He pushed the door open without knocking. She was standing by the window, back to the room, arms crossed. She didn't turn. I'm not in the mood for another board member begging me to stay, she said. I'm not a board member, her shoulders tensed. Slowly, she turned. Her face had none of the polish it usually wore in public. No makeup, hair pulled back, eyes tired. But when she saw him, something cracked. What are you doing here? She asked quietly. You're making a mistake. I'm fixing one. No, you're running from something you don't have to fight alone. She held his gaze. I'm not going to let them tear you apart. You're not giving me any say in that. She stepped toward him, voice low. Do you know what it's like to pick up the newspaper and see your name next to words like disgrace and scandal? He met her eyes. Do you know what it's like to tell your daughter that the woman she adores might not be coming back because some people think love has a salary cap? She faltered. I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting the idea of me, not the man standing in front of you who's not afraid of a fight, especially not for you. She turned away, her hands trembling. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. You're not, he said. But walking away from this, from me, that's how I lose everything. Francesca's voice broke. I don't know how to be with someone who doesn't need me to be perfect. I don't need perfect, he said. I need real. And when you're laughing with Rosie, when you're sitting at my kitchen table with flour on your blouse, when you're not performing for anyone, that's the woman I fell for. She turned back to him, tears in her eyes. You love me, he stepped closer, closing the space between them. I haven't stopped since the second you walked into that garage. A tear slipped down her cheek. Then why does this feel impossible? Because it matters, he whispered. Because it's worth everything. She reached for him, and he caught her in his arms, holding her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Later that evening, Francesca called an emergency board meeting. She didn't resign. Instead, she stood in front of the men and women who had built empires with her and said, You've trusted me to lead this company through storms. This is no different. My personal life is not a liability. It's a reminder that I'm still human. And if any of you think love makes me less capable, I invite you to find someone else who can triple our revenue in 18 months. No one challenged her. The story didn't vanish overnight, but the press lost interest when she didn't flinch. The headlines changed. The drama faded. And in its place, something new bloomed. Spring came early that year, and with it, a rooftop transformed. Finn stepped out of the elevator in a tailored navy suit, one hand in Rosie's as she wore a flower crown and spun in place. The rooftop had been strung with white lights, tables set with candles and gold-rimmed glasses. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and the city's skyline unfurled around them like a promise. Francesca waited beneath a canopy of silk and roses, her dress champagne-colored and simple, her eyes never leaving his. The ceremony was short, personal, just close friends, family, and a justice of the peace with kind eyes. When Francesca placed the ring on his finger, her hands didn't shake. I never imagined this, she whispered, but I've never been more sure. Finn smiled. I didn't think I'd ever get this lucky. Rosie stood between them, beaming, holding both their hands. Afterward, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and lanterns floated into the air, Finn pulled Francesca into a slow dance. I was thinking, he said, maybe we could take that trip you always talked about. She raised an eyebrow. Which one? The one where we don't check our phones for 5 days and end up somewhere we can't pronounce. She grinned. I'll book the tickets. He kissed her forehead. You already gave me everything I wanted. And what's that? Home. As the music played and the city stretched below them, Francesca laid her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in either of their lives, the world didn't feel like a place they had to escape. They had built something stronger than wealth, deeper than fear. They had found each other, and refused to let go. Finn stood barefoot in the doorway of the sunlit kitchen, watching as Francesca attempted to flip a pancake. The spatula wobbled in her grip and the batter landed off-center, lopsided and steaming. She stared at it like it had insulted her. That is the most offensive breakfast I've ever made, she muttered. Finn leaned against the frame. It's got character. I was aiming for symmetry. You own $1 billion company. You're allowed to fail at pancakes. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel that read World's Okayest Chef. I've been thinking about something. Does it involve replacing me with a short-order cook? No, she said, sliding the plate onto the table with a defeated sigh. It involves us. His expression shifted. What about us? I've spent my whole life building things. Companies, networks, a reputation, but I've never built something that mattered this much. I don't want to keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. There's no shoe, he said, just us, right now. She pulled out a chair and sat, folding her hands. My mother called last night. He joined her, his brow lifting. Everything okay? She wants to meet you. Finn blinked. Are you sure that's a good idea? She's not like my father. She doesn't care what anyone's resume says. She just wants to know who makes me happy. And you told her that's me. Francesca reached across the table and took his hand. I told her I've never had a home until now. He didn't respond right away, just turned her hand over in his, tracing the lines in her palm with his thumb as if memorizing them. I've never been this scared. Or this sure. 2 weeks later, they stood outside a garden cafe tucked into a quiet corner of the city. Francesca's mother, Evelyn, was already seated at her wrought iron table, wearing a silk scarf and sunglasses that made her look like she'd just stepped out of a black and white film. Francesca kissed her cheek and introduced them. Evelyn studied Finn for a moment, her gaze steady but not unkind. You're taller than I expected, she said. People say that a lot, Finn replied. And you're the one who returned the necklace. Yes, ma'am. Must have been tempting to keep it. No, ma'am. Evelyn gave a small nod. Then we'll get along just fine. Over lunch, she asked Finn questions about his life, real questions, not the polite kind. She listened when he spoke about his upbringing, his garage, the way Rosie helped him pick out his socks. By the end of the meal, Evelyn reached for her purse and pulled out a silver locket. This belonged to my mother, she said, placing it in Francesca's hand. I was saving it for the day I knew you were with someone who would never let you fall alone. Francesca's throat tightened. Mom, Evelyn stood and kissed her daughter's forehead. He's not what I expected, but then again, neither are you lately. And I'm proud of both. That night, Francesca curled up beside Finn in bed, her body pressed against his as the city murmured outside. When this began, I didn't think it would last past that first cup of coffee, she said. I didn't think someone like you would even remember my name. She smiled, fingers drawing circles on his chest. Do you think we'll always live like this? Between two worlds, I think we'll make our own. The next morning, Finn dropped Rosie off at school and returned to find the garage buzzing. Theo waved him over, holding up a thick envelope. This came for you. Finn opened it slowly. Inside was a letter on cream paper bearing the Zeller Foundation's seal. It was a grant, a large one, enough to expand the garage, add apprenticeships, and launch a training program for young adults aging out of the foster system. At the bottom was a signature, Francesca Zeller. He found her later that evening, sitting on the back steps of their apartment building, barefoot with a mug of tea in her lap. You went behind my back, he said, holding the letter. I didn't want you to feel like I was handing you anything. You earned it. I just gave it a push. He sat beside her. You know you didn't have to, I know, she said. But I wanted to build something with you, something that lasts. Finn stared at the paper, then at her. You're impossible. And you love me for it, he didn't answer. He stood, pulled her up with him, and walked her into the apartment without a word. Then, without preamble, he opened the drawer beside the couch, pulled out a small velvet box, and dropped to one knee, her breath caught. "Francesca Zeller," he said, voice steady. "I don't have a yacht or a private island. I can't offer you anything that glitters. But I can promise you laughter after hard days, pancakes that never come out right, and a life where you'll never question whether you're loved." She stared down at him, eyes wide. "So," he continued, "will you marry me and ruin every fancy gala by bringing me as your plus one?" She laughed through her tears and dropped to her knees, kissing him before she could say the word. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. 1,000 times yes. A year later, under a canopy of autumn leaves in a vineyard just outside the city, they said their vows. Rosie was the flower girl, tossing petals with the solemnity of a priestess. Theo officiated, wearing a suit 2 sizes too big and sunglasses to hide his tears. Francesca wore a dress so simple it could have been mistaken for casual, until you looked closer and saw the hand-stitched constellations along the hem. Finn wore a gray suit with a sapphire pinned to the lapel. When he lifted her veil, he whispered, "Still think I'm out of my league," she whispered back. "You were never in a league. You were something entirely your own." They danced beneath string lights and drank from mismatched glasses. The guests ranged from board members to mechanics, socialites to preschool teachers. No one cared about titles, only about the way Francesca looked at Finn and the way he never stopped looking back. Later that night, after the music faded and the vineyard grew quiet, they stood by the balcony of their private cottage, the moonlight painting silver across the floor. Francesca leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you ever think about how weird this all is? Us?" he asked. "No, just that a necklace and a 5-year-old's sharp eyes led to this. I think about it every day." She turned, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Then promise me something, anything. When life gets loud again, and it will, I want you to remind me of this moment. Of how quiet love can be." He kissed her forehead. "I'll remind you, and when you forget again, I'll remind you louder." They made love slowly that night, not like the world was ending, but like it was just beginning. In the years that followed, they built everything together. The garage expanded. Finn trained a dozen young mechanics who called him boss, but treated him like a mentor. Francesca stepped back from day-to-day boardroom battles, focusing instead on steering the foundation toward causes that actually kept her up at night. Rosie grew into a fierce, curious girl who called Francesca Mom without hesitation and told everyone her parents fixed cars and ran the world. They traveled when they could, argued without cruelty, and forgave without delay. And through every twist, they held onto the one thing neither had ever believed they'd find: a love that didn't ask them to choose between who they were and who they could become. They chose each other, over and over, always.